Vorella's last roar. When humans fought beside beasts, the sky above the planet, Vorella burned with shades of red and gold as the Terran's starfreighter Morningstar broke through the upper atmosphere, flames licking its sides. Alarms screamed across the control deck, sparks flew from overloaded panels, and the ship's hull groaned under the force of re-entry. Inside, the crew fought to stabilize the ship, but it was clear to everyone on board they weren't going to make it to the surface in one piece. Commander Reese gave the order to brace for impact as the jungle canopy rushed up toward them. Then came the crash, a violent, bone-jarring slam that tore through the trees and left a long, smoking trail across the dense alien forest. Everything went still for a moment, save for the crackling of flames and the distant calls of unknown creatures. Elena Varric, the ship's medic, pulled herself from the twisted frame of her safety harness, blood dripping from a cut on her forehead. Around her, the crew groaned and coughed, struggling to recover from the landing. The air inside the wreck was thick with smoke and fuel vapors, and lights flickered as emergency systems struggled to stay online. Vorella wasn't supposed to be their destination. It was just a waypoint, but a navigation failure during a hyperjump had left them drifting into the path of this uncharted planet. No one knew much about it, except that it was marked as dangerous, unstable, and best avoided. Now, it was their prison. They gathered supplies, checked for injuries, and quickly realized they had limited oxygen, dwindling food, and no way to call for help. Vorella's magnetic storms blocked all signals. They had to survive until someone came looking. If anyone came at all. As night fell, the forest around the wreck came alive. Strange shapes moved between trees, glowing eyes peered from the darkness, and distant howls echoed across the landscape. The jungle wasn't just alive, it was watching. Elena led a small team to scavenge for anything useful from the crash site. While searching near a cluster of burnt debris, she heard a soft, high-pitched whimper. At first, she thought it was one of the crew, but when she followed the sound, she found something completely unexpected. Beneath a collapsed panel and tangled wires, a creature lay barely breathing, scaly, fur-lined, and clearly in pain. Its eyes were slitted and intelligent, its claws sharp but twitching weakly. It was a cub. And not just any cub. Elena recognized it from the limited files stored in the ship's database. It was a Dravrax, a species known throughout several star systems as apex predators, unmatched in strength, speed, and cunning. They were said to be nearly impossible to tame, fiercely territorial, and terrifyingly intelligent. Their homeworld was supposedly uninhabited by sentient life because nothing could survive their dominance. Her instincts told her to back away, to leave the creature and warn the others. But something in the way it struggled to breathe, its ribs rising and falling in jerky, painful motions, made her pause. It was just a baby. It hadn't attacked. It was suffering. She radioed Reese and the others, but the response was immediate: leave it. It's too dangerous. Elena hesitated. She was a medic first, and this thing, predator or not, was dying. Carefully, she cleared the debris, used a shock blanket to lift the creature, and took it back to the shelter they'd built near the cave wall beside the wreck. She worked through the night, cleaning wounds, injecting antibiotics, and using what little tech she had left. The cub never attacked, only stared at her with wide golden eyes. It didn't understand what she was, but it wasn't afraid. The rest of the crew was divided. Some believed Elena was making a huge mistake. Others, watching how the cub didn't lash out, began to wonder. Still, they posted guards and slept in shifts. The jungle was unpredictable, and the presence of the cub made them uneasy. They had no idea what kind of attention it might bring. On the second night, that question was answered. It began with silence. All the noises of the forest stopped. The buzzing insects, the distant bird calls, the rustling of leaves gone. Then came a low rumble, deep and primal, from the trees. The guards raised their rifles. Shadows moved at the edge of the firelight. Trees bent. Something huge was coming. The crew gathered, standing protectively around their makeshift camp. And then, with a roar that shook the earth, she arrived. The matriarch Dravrax stepped into the clearing, her body towering over the humans, her armored scales shimmering in the firelight. Her eyes locked instantly on the cub, then shifted to Elena. Her muscles tensed, claws extended. She was the embodiment of fury and grace, every inch a creature that had never lost a fight. The humans froze, weapons up, but knowing they'd be useless. Elena stepped forward slowly, heart pounding. She didn't speak, there was no point. Instead, she lowered her arms, knelt beside the cub and backed away, showing she meant no harm. The matriarch growled low and stepped closer, inspecting the cub. Her eyes narrowed. Then she sniffed Elena one slow, deliberate breath. Something in her changed. She didn't strike. She looked at her cub again, then scanned the faces of the humans. Before anyone could speak, a shriek came from the jungle, a pack of smaller beasts, hungry and fast, broke into the clearing, eyes glowing, jaws snapping. The crew opened fire, but there were too many. That's when the matriarch let out a roar that shook the trees. She lunged, claws tearing through the attackers with brutal force, her tail crushing skulls, her jaws snapping bones. The battle lasted less than a minute. The matriarch stood over the bodies, blood dripping from her mouth. Then, calmly, she returned to her cub. The humans didn't move. They watched, stunned, as she nudged the cub gently. It stirred, blinked, and made a soft sound. The matriarch lowered her head beside it, then turned to the humans once more. Without warning, she turned and vanished into the jungle, the cub cradled in her jaws. But before she left, she swiped a tree with one massive claw, leaving a glowing mark that shimmered faintly in the dark. Elena stared at it, her chest tight with a feeling she couldn't explain. It wasn't a warning. It was something else. A symbol. A message. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she could feel it deep inside. This wasn't the last they'd see of the Dravrax. And somewhere in the shadows of Vorella, the wild was watching them back. Morning came slowly in the Vorellan wilds, and with it came an uneasy silence that settled like fog over the jungle, making even the bravest members of the crew feel watched. The survivors of the Morning Star had barely slept after the events of the previous night, and though the fire still burned low in their makeshift camp, none of its warmth reached their nerves. Commander Reese paced restlessly, his eyes on the glowing claw mark on the tree near the wreckage left there by the massive predator that had spared their lives. He didn't trust it, not one bit. Yet even he couldn't deny what they had all seen with their own eyes. The matriarch Dravrax had not only taken back her cub without attacking them, but she had defended the humans from the ambush of savage beasts like a guardian watching over allies. Elena sat near the edge of the fire pit, running her hands over a cracked medkit, her thoughts elsewhere. Her mind replayed the moment the creature had stood over her, close enough to kill, but instead had sniffed, stared, and walked away. There was intelligence in those eyes, not just animal instinct. That fact scared her more than anything, because it meant this planet wasn't just dangerous, it was smart, and it was watching them with purpose. The jungle felt denser than before, as if the trees had grown closer overnight, and when the crew split up into smaller scouting groups to search for more salvage, they did so with rifles ready and nerves stretched thin. It didn't take long before something strange happened again. A scout team, led by Engineer Malik, returned early, pale-faced and breathless. They claimed they had seen the Dravrax again. No, not just 1-2 massive shapes moving through the jungle, fast but silent, never coming close, only watching. Malik insisted they were being tracked. Commander Reese tightened security, doubled the perimeter watch, and ordered no one to go out alone, but the tension only grew. Every hour, someone heard movement beyond the tree line, heavy footsteps or low growls, but when they turned to look, nothing. It was like the shadows had learned how to breathe. That evening, the crew gathered again near the campfire, trying to maintain some sense of order. Food rations were low, batteries dying, and with no signal reaching out of the planet's magnetic field, it felt more and more like they were on their own. The mood was grim. Elena suggested that the glowing tree mark might be more than a symbol, it might be a sign of territory or communication. She believed the matriarch hadn't just spared them, but had marked them under her protection. Reese rejected the idea at first, claiming it was too risky to assume it. Creature like that could be reasoned with. She didn't eat us, that's all, he said. Next time might be different. But deep down, some of the crew started to believe otherwise. That night, while the others rested in the shelter, Elena stepped out alone. She felt something pulling her to the edge of the jungle, near the place where she had first found the cub. The air was still too still, and the sounds of the wild had gone completely silent again. She crouched beside the wreckage and waited, heart pounding, not sure what she expected to see. Then, she saw it, eyes glowing faintly in the distance, between the trees. The matriarch had returned. Shatara, as Elena later came to call her, stepped slowly into the clearing, her massive form gliding between the trees like a shadow. She was silent but powerful, her muscles tense, her eyes locked onto Elena. No growl, no roar, just a slow, cautious approach. Elena didn't move. She kept her hands open and low, letting the creature come to her. The cub was with her now, walking unsteadily but alive. The creature paused just feet from her, staring down with a look that was neither rage nor gratitude, just focus. Then, without warning, Shatara turned and looked toward the jungle, her nostrils flaring. Something else was out there. Elena followed her gaze, sensing danger before it revealed itself. Suddenly, a loud mechanical whine cut through the air, and lights flickered across the treetops. Drones. Not wildlife. Not predators. Machines. Something metallic and foreign had entered the jungle, and Shatara didn't like it. Her body tensed, and with a sudden burst of motion, she pushed Elena behind her as if protecting her. From the trees, sleek black shapes flew forward, flying surveillance drones, weapons hot, scanning the area. One of them spotted the wreckage and lit up red. Elena ducked, realizing immediately these weren't rescue bots. They were military or worse, corporate. Unauthorized. A red light flicked across her chest, and before she could react, Shatara leapt into the air with a snarl and crushed the drone in her jaws like paper. The jungle erupted in chaos. More drones appeared, this time with taser charges and net launchers, attempting to trap the apex predator. The matriarch roared, swinging her tail and smashing one into a tree so hard it exploded. Elena ran back to the shelter, shouting for help, as the crew scrambled for weapons. The camp burst into a war zone. Lasers flashed, trees caught fire, and in the center of it all, Shatara fought like a beast of legend. One of the drones shot a net toward her cub, but Elena sprinted and knocked it aside just in time. The matriarch saw it. Their eyes met. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not fear. Not threat. Understanding. By the time the last drone was destroyed, the forest was littered with broken machinery and burning leaves. The matriarch stood over her cub once again, blood and metal on her claws. The humans, though shaken, stood in awe. Reese lowered his rifle. The look on his face had changed. No longer suspicion, now curiosity. The jungle had gone quiet again, but this time, it felt like the calm after an agreement. Shatara walked forward slowly, right up to the camp, then clawed a second mark, this time on the rock beside the human's shelter. It glowed the same way as the tree mark, but brighter, stronger. Elena stepped forward, barely breathing. The matriarch leaned down, snorted once, and then turned away. She left without another glance, her cub following. And just like that, she was gone. But her message was clear. She wasn't just warning others now. She had claimed them. Not as prey. As allies. And somewhere beyond the firelight, other eyes were watching too. The drones meant something. Someone else was coming. Not just to rescue, but to conquer. And now, on this wild and dangerous world, the humans had a guardian far deadlier than any weapon they had brought. But what that alliance would cost them, they had yet to find out. The jungle didn't return to normal after the drone attack had changed. The shadows felt heavier. The sounds of wildlife became distant, almost like the forest itself was holding its breath. The crew of the Morning Star had survived the ambush, but the attack had shaken their sense of time and safety. Now they knew the real threat might not be the creatures of Vorella, but something far more familiar: other humans. No one knew who had sent the drones, but the design was unmistakably corporate black steel. No identification, high-grade surveillance tech built for capturing, not rescuing. Whoever they were, they hadn't come to help. Commander Reese gathered his team around the glowing rock where Shatara had left her second mark, staring at it with a mix of suspicion and reluctant respect. It still pulsed faintly, casting an eerie light on their faces. "She protected us," Elena said firmly, her voice low but certain. "She didn't have to, but she did. And now we know why. She saw them as a threat, too." Malik, still nursing a bruised arm from earlier, frowned. "You think the Dravraks hate them as much as we do?" Elena met his eyes. "I think they've seen them before." That suggestion hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. If Vorella was uncharted and supposedly untouched, how had Shatara known how to respond to those machines so quickly? Unless, of course, it wasn't the first time. For the next 2 days, the humans stayed close to camp, repairing what little tech they had and reinforcing defenses, but the sense of isolation was gone. They didn't feel alone anymore, not in a protective way, but in the way prey doesn't feel alone in a hunter's territory. Sometimes, just out of sight, large shapes moved through the jungle. They never came close. They didn't need to. The message was clear: you are being watched, but you are not yet hunted. Elena started marking locations on a crude map made from scraps of metal and cloth, tracking the patterns of movement. One thing stood out: there was a boundary the Dravraks didn't cross. Beyond a certain point in the jungle, the movement stopped. A dead zone. No sound, no animal life, and not even the trees looked the same. They were twisted, blackened at the tips, as if poisoned. Reese finally agreed to investigate. He led a small team, including Elena, toward the edge of that zone. The deeper they went, the colder the air felt, not in temperature, but in sensation, like walking into the mouth of a cave that had never seen light. Then they found it. Half buried in vines and roots was a structure metal, scorched and ancient. Not a ship, but a station of some kind. A forward outpost. Human-made. Elena brushed dirt from the side and uncovered a logo, faded but still visible: Kavros Interstellar Industries. Her stomach dropped. Kavros wasn't a rescue agency. It was a weapons company known for exploiting planets, stripping resources, and disappearing locals who asked too many questions. They were the reason dozens of colonies had gone dark without explanation. Vorella wasn't uninhabited. It had been hidden. Inside the structure, the air was thick and stale. They found evidence of old experiments, cages, broken equipment, bones that weren't human, logs corrupted by time, but one message still flashed on a dim screen: Subject 9B2 intelligent. Hostile. Terminate all attempts. The subject's image was fuzzy but unmistakable. A young Dravraks. A cub. Elena's hands shook. They had been here before. They had tried to control the predators and failed. Now it made sense why Shatara had spared them. She had seen the difference. These weren't the same humans. But her hatred of those who came before still burned. Reese ordered the team back to camp, but as they turned, a sudden screech echoed through the tree's metal again, not beasts. Drones. This time, they weren't scouting. They were hunting. One of them burst from the canopy, weapons locked. The team scattered, returning fire, but they were pinned. Then, from the trees behind them, came the thunderous roar of salvation. Shatara. She exploded from the shadows like a storm unleashed, tearing through the drones with terrifying speed. Her claws sliced through armor, her teeth crushed the core of the lead drone. Elena ducked behind a fallen tree, watching in awe as the matriarch fought not for survival but for vengeance. These machines were reminders of what had been done to her kind. The battle ended quickly, and Shatara stood over the wreckage, her sides heaving. She turned her head toward Elena again, but this time her eyes didn't show suspicion. They showed recognition. Reese stepped out, hands raised. "We're not them," he said softly, almost to himself. Shatara snorted, then looked to the old outpost. She clawed the ground once, then began to walk not away, but beside them. Not leading. Not following. Walking with them. From that moment, a strange alliance began to form. Back at camp, the humans worked while the jungle watched. More Dravreks appeared in the distance, never too close, never threatening, just present. Elena realized the unspoken truth. They were being tested. Every move they made, every choice, was being judged. Trust wouldn't come easy. But that night, as they circled the fire and shared the scraps of food, a low, rumbling sound came from the trees. Not a growl. A call. Then silence. Elena stood slowly and walked to the edge of the light, her eyes searching the dark. There, between the trees, stood the cub. It didn't run. It didn't hide. It just watched. Then, slowly, it stepped forward, paused, and dropped something on the ground, a piece of meat, freshly hunted. A gift. Elena knelt, picked it up, and looked back at the shadows. The cub disappeared again, but its message was clear. The Dravraks didn't see them as enemies anymore. Not yet friends, but something in between. And in the cold stars above Vorella, someone else was watching too. The drones were just scouts. The real storm hadn't come yet. The forest no longer felt like an alien jungle. It felt like a battlefield waiting for its next war. Days had passed since the last drone attack, but the humans knew better than to think the threat was over. The silence in the air was not peaceful. It was waiting. Commander Reese stood at the edge of the camp, staring into the trees where glowing eyes sometimes blinked in the night and heavy footsteps moved beyond sight. They weren't alone, not anymore, and they weren't just guests. They were caught between two worlds. On one side was the jungle, wild and ancient, ruled by the Dravraks, the apex predators who now watched the humans with wary eyes. On the other side was the shadow of human greed, the invisible presence of Kavros Interstellar Industries, whose drones had already shown their intentions to capture, to dominate, to extract. And somewhere out there, more were coming. Elena had become the closest thing to a link between the two species, spending hours walking the edge of the jungle, leaving small offerings, food or water, sometimes tools. The cub returned often now, curious and less fearful, and the matriarch, Shatara, sometimes appeared nearby, silent and still, like a guardian spirit of the wild. It was no longer about survival. It was about preparation, because when the real enemy came, neither humans nor Dravraks could face it alone. The warnings came subtly at first. Trees fell in the distance without wind. The ground shook beneath the roots. Strange lights flickered across the sky in the dead of night, far too organized to be natural. Elena found one of the old communication towers active again, its screen flashing an encrypted signal, a countdown. Something was being deployed from orbit. She told Reese, and for once, he didn't argue. "They're not just sending drones this time," he said grimly. "They're coming in person." The next morning, a ship pierced the clouds. It didn't land gently. It tore through the canopy like a spear, shaking the earth with its arrival. It was a Kavros landing craft, armed and armored, and it didn't come alone. Several smaller vessels followed, dropping soldiers into the jungle in tight units, scanning the terrain, weapons hot. This wasn't a rescue. This was a hunting party. Not for animals. For control. Reese immediately called everyone back to camp and activated the last of their defenses, but it wouldn't be enough. These weren't scavengers. These were trained mercenaries, used to wiping out anything that stood in the way of profit. And the Dravraks stood in their way. By midday, the jungle burned. Explosions echoed through the forest, fire streaked the sky, and the sounds of gunfire and screaming creatures filled the air. The hunters had found their prey, but they had not expected a fight like this. Shatara and her kin struck with precision, using the jungle as a weapon, ambushing patrols from the treetops and vanishing into the mist. For every predator they killed, two more arrived. But for every human soldier that fell, the cost was heavier. The battle had begun. Elena watched it unfold like a nightmare. She and Malik worked frantically to modify signal jammers, trying to break the connection between the soldiers and their ships. Reese organized the crew into defensive lines, using broken wreckage as barriers, knowing they were vastly outgunned. Then came the worst moment. A captured Dravraks, a young male, was dragged into the clearing by mercenaries. They had bound it in electrified nets and paraded it like a trophy. One of the commanders, helmeted and cold, announced over a loudspeaker that this was just the beginning, that the beasts of Vorella would kneel to human power, and that any creature native or not would be put down if it stood in their way. That was the moment everything changed. From the trees, Shatara roared. It was a sound that silenced even the machines. Then came the answer, dozens of roars from across the jungle. The Dravraks were no longer fighting in scattered bursts. They had united. They attacked as one. A wave of claws, teeth, and rage swept through the mercenaries' front lines, and chaos erupted. Amidst the fire and smoke, Elena and Malik used the distraction to disable the nearest ship's uplink, throwing the enemy into confusion. Reese led a counterstrike, covering the Dravraks as they freed the captive and turned the enemy's own weapons against them. It was a brutal, primal battle one that combined the raw fury of nature with the desperate determination of humans who had nothing left to lose. And through it all, Shatara fought like a creature possessed. She tore through armor, leapt through flames, and stood at the heart of the war like a living storm. As night fell, the jungle turned red with firelight, but the enemy line had broken. The surviving mercenaries fled to their last remaining dropship, trying to signal evacuation. Elena, wounded but standing, limped to the top of the nearest ridge and raised a flare signal to Shatara. The matriarch looked up, bloodied but unbroken. She growled, turned, and charged the landing craft. The humans followed. Together, they brought it down. Not with missiles or machines, but with fury and unity. The last ship exploded in a roar of metal and flame, and then, at last, silence fell. True silence. The kind that came after victory. But also, after loss. In the morning, the survivors gathered what remained. The jungle smoked, but it was alive. Reese found Elena beside the cub, who had been wounded in the fight but still walked proudly. Shatara stood behind them, not as a beast, not as a monster, but as a queen of her world. For the first time, humans and Dravraks stood together, not just as allies in war, but as something more. Hunters of two worlds, bound not by peace, but by shared blood, pain, and survival. And far above them, hidden in the cold silence of space, eyes watched. Kavros had lost the first battle. But war. War was just beginning. The jungle of Vorella had changed, but peace did not follow victory. Smoke still floated through the trees, the earth was scarred by battle, and the silence was heavy, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. The humans and Dravraks had fought side by side, but both sides had suffered. Elena stood at the edge of the clearing, her arm wrapped in makeshift bandages, watching the cub limp through the tall grass, its once bright eyes dimmed by pain and exhaustion. Shatara stood nearby, covered in wounds, her breathing slow but steady. She did not rest, she watched the sky. The enemy had retreated but not disappeared. Kavros was a machine, and machines did not give up. When they failed, they regrouped. When they lost, they calculated. And somewhere in the cold silence of space above, those calculations were being made. Reese and the crew worked without sleep, building a last defense out of scraps and broken tech, knowing full well it might not hold. "They'll come again," Reese said, voice low. "And next time, they won't send scouts. They'll bring the hammer." No one argued. No one pretended otherwise. There was no place left to run, no signal strong enough to call for help, no allies outside this dying jungle. The last stand would happen here on Vorella, in the ruins of fire and blood, with beasts and humans fighting side by side one final time. That night, a strange wind moved through the trees, and with it came an eerie sound, deep, low, mechanical. A hum, too perfect to be natural. Elena froze. She had heard that sound before in the wreckage of the Kavros outpost. It was the signal of a terraformer preparing to clear a zone. Kavros wasn't just coming to reclaim their prize. They were going to erase the jungle itself. One of the satellites in orbit had turned toward Vorella, and the first pulse would come at sunrise. Anything within the target zone would be destroyed: animals, plants, shelters, all of it. It was how the company cleared obstacles without risking soldiers. They would call it an uninhabited sweep. Reese's voice trembled with anger as he stared at the readings. They're gonna wipe the whole region clean and pretend nothing was ever here. But Elena was already moving. She didn't need orders. She didn't need plans. She had seen this kind of silence in Shatara's eyes before the last ambush, before the last charge. The matriarch already knew. And still, she did not run. When Elena approached the edge of the jungle, she found the Dravraks gathered, more than she had ever seen before, injured, tired, but standing. Shatara stood at the center, the cub beside her. The older predator locked eyes with Elena, and in that moment, no translator was needed. They had one fight left, and they would not run from it. The humans prepared what they could. Signal jammers were tuned to interfere with the satellite. EMP charges were planted around the landing zones. It would not stop the blast, but it might delay it. Reese ordered all non-essential crew to stay low, take cover, and save power. Then he handed Elena the last working flare and nodded. When it starts, you know what to do. Dawn broke slow and red. Not a warm red, but the color of danger. High in the sky, the first rumble began, followed by a glow that spread like a growing wound. Then came the ships. Sleek, black, and soulless, they cut through the clouds like knives. But this time, the jungle did not flinch. It roared. Dravraks leapt from the trees like shadows with teeth, catching soldiers before they hit the ground. The cub, smaller but fierce, darted between metal legs and bit deep into armor joints. Shatara was everywhere faster than sight. The humans covered from behind, blasting open fuel tanks and triggering ambushes. The jungle itself fought back. Vines collapsed walkways, roots snapped landing gear, and fire raced across oil-soaked leaves. But the machines didn't stop. More soldiers came. More blasts fell. And above it all, the satellite began to charge. Elena watched the sky. The timer flashed on her wrist. 3 minutes. She grabbed the flare and climbed the broken tower at the center of camp. From there, she could see everything: the jungle burning, Shatara bleeding, Reese shouting orders, and the cub fighting like it had already seen too much death for one life. 2 minutes. She saw the last of the signal jammers spark and die. 1 minute. She aimed the flare straight into the air. A red line streaked the sky. Shatara looked up, paused, and then released the loudest, deepest roar Elena had ever heard. It was not pain. It was not fear. It was defiance. A call. A warning. A final cry of a predator that would not go quietly. And the jungle responded. All at once, the remaining Dravraks charged. They tore through the final lines and reached the base of the satellite uplink that was guiding the blast. And there, with her last strength, Shatara leapt. Higher than she ever had before. Straight into the heart of the machine. The explosion wasn't big, but it was enough. The satellite feed stuttered. The beam shifted, and the blast missed. It hit the empty ridge beyond the jungle, a flash of light swallowing rock and sky. The jungle survived. But Shatara didn't return. Elena climbed down in silence. She walked to the place where the matriarch had last stood. Only scorched earth and twisted metal remained. The cub came quietly and lay beside it. No cry. No sound. Just the silence of loss. The survivors gathered that night not as two species, but as one. A circle of fire burned in the heart of the jungle, and the cub stood at its edge, eyes shining in the flames. Elena placed a carved stone at the center, shaped like a claw, and whispered words that didn't need translating. She was more than a beast. She was a protector, a mother, a warrior. And her roar saved 2 worlds. Above them, the stars watched quietly. And far away, in the heart of space, Kavros recorded the loss as a data failure. But those who had lived through it never forgot. On Vorella, they rebuilt not alone, but together. And every night, when the wind moved through the trees just right, the jungle seemed to echo with the faint, distant sound of one last roar.